Hello, and in this video I'll be showing you how you can take a game asset model and convert it into a model which is more high fidelity for the purpose of 3D printing. Now, lots of people go ahead, they rip models out of games, they print them out, and then they're very blocky and low fidelity. And often it's not a great result. So I'm just going to be focusing in this video is not the exporting process of how to get a model from a game, but rather once you have a model, how can you change it so you've got a much smoother result? And the example I will be using today is the engineer from Risk of Rain 2. Here on my right, I have my low poly 3D printed Risk of Rain model. No changes whatsoever. As you can see, he is quite blocky and very faceted. Is that my milk? That's not my milk. It's clothes. Where was I? Oh yes, so taking my low fidelity model and changing it to what we have here, which has a lot more curvature, is a lot more smooth, and if you wanted to paint it for like a diorama or to have as a miniature, is going to give you a much better final result. The program of choice I will be using is 3ds Max, and although I am using 3ds Max, all the skills and things I talk about are transferable to your 3D program of choice, so whether it's Maya or Blender, or I guess technically Sketchfab as well if you want to use that. Now, the nature of this video is much more tutorial, educational. It's not as much entertainment value. So if you're not necessarily interested in converting models yourself, but you do want to learn a little bit more about the process or how it can be done, it can also be worth a watch in that way. So anyway, let's get to it. Here we are in 3ds Max. On the left, we have our low poly mesh, which has been exported from Risk of Rain 2. It is the engineer model. And on the right, we have a much more dense, high fidelity, high poly model, which is much more suitable for 3D printing. I will be covering things such as checking our mesh, quadrifying our mesh, increasing geometry, adding supporting edges, maintaining our silhouette, what you don't need to touch, and filling in any holes that could cause problems in the slicer. Before we start, let's talk about the main problem we encounter when we want to print a model which has been exported from a video game. Now, video game models tend to be low poly. Even if they appear high detail, the model itself in the game tends to be low poly, and often the detail is baked on. In a game such as Risk of Rain 2, the model is low poly but appears to be smooth. So if we have a look here, we can see that we've got a polygon, 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 and we've got some hard edges. However, if we press F4 and we get rid of our wireframe, we can see that it appears completely smooth. And if we have a look on our much high denser mesh, it also appears smooth. This is because of smoothing groups. If we go over to the right here, we can see what is a low poly mesh. If we go ahead and export our asset for 3D printing, it will print out only the geometry which is there. In a game, we have a smoothing group, which makes it appear smooth. So even though it appears smooth, it actually prints out really blocky and has a really blocky silhouette, which is very faceted. The only way to make this more smooth is to add more geometry and turbo smooth. So if I just press this here, we can see both of these two have the same geometry, will both print out exactly the same. If we want more and a smoother silhouette, we need to add more polys. So that is our problem. And that is the main thing we need to fix. And just an example, I'll just quickly select the chest piece. I'm going to clear all to the smoothing groups, press F4 again, and we can now see all of those hard edges. So when we do go ahead and actually print this asset, this is what we get. It's not suitable for painting and looks very bad as a display unless you're specifically going for a low poly aesthetic. Before we start editing our mesh, we still need to check the exported model itself and check for any errors. Models that are exported or ripped from games often have errors such as being mirrors, having their normals flipped, or having geometry not welded or attached together anymore. So let's quickly go through that. So this model, as it's been exported, has actually been exported mirrored. Unfortunately, I didn't realize it was mirrored to the end, and it's something I really should have done at the start. In game, the wristband here is actually on this arm, and I should have mirrored it, no clone, so that it's flipped like this. Unfortunately, I forgot to check before I started. Secondly, we can check for flipped normals. If our normals are flipped, our mesh won't print out correctly and also won't display correctly in our scene. So if your mesh has a lot of big, dense black areas, the normals may be flipped. So you can quickly check this by selecting your mesh, and as we see, our mesh is a nice pinkish color. However, if we click flip, suddenly the mesh is much darker. So if you do export a mesh and it looks like this, just go and flip your normals. Fortunately for me, nothing was flipped on this one. Third, but most importantly, we need to check that our mesh is attached together and welded together and all our points join correctly. So if we go ahead and select our mesh here, I'm using select element, so select the whole object where every piece of geometry is attached to. And as we can see here, this is not attached to this polygon, all of this upper section, this box here, and this section here. All of this is separate, and if I pull it away, it's all just going to come apart. This is not what we want. None of this will print whatsoever. So, easy solution, nice and simple. Select polygons, weld. Okay? Completely ruins our smoothing groups, and if you see, look, we've got all these lines, and it looks strange. However, it has worked. So if I go back to select element, and I select this, select this, we can see the entire top half is now together, and we can start working on it. Our body is now completely together, and each individual part. So this is now something which we can go ahead, work with, and edit. While our mesh now doesn't have any major errors, we can't just go ahead and increase the geometry. So if we tessellate or add a turbo smooth to make our mesh denser, so it's much more suitable for 3D printing, so we don't get big blocks around it, we can't just take it and increase our geometry as much as possible. The main reason for this is because we lose all of our silhouettes. So if we have a look here, as we turbo smooth, we are destroying our mesh. So we need to go ahead and add supporting geometry. To give you a nice easy representation of this, we'll go over to here. Okay, here are two assets, here are two boxes. If I want this box to have increased geometry so that this edge here doesn't look faceted and doesn't look blocky, I will need to turbo smooth, but if I just do that without increasing any edge density, it will just cave in and fall in on itself, similar to this model over here. What we need to do is to chamfer and bevel our edges so we have some nice edge loops going on. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to quickly select our mesh here. Now anything we want smooth, we do not want to chamfer, like this. So I'm just going to quickly add a chamfer. Excellent, and now I'm going to add a turbo smooth and tessellate. Excellent. And by doing that, we are now maintaining our shape. Now, if we have anything that is blocky like this, with no actual curved geometry, we do not actually need to edit that piece of geometry. If we go ahead and look at my final high poly result, you will see that this upper section does not have much geometry whatsoever. This is because every edge is a hard edge and there's no curvature. However, these sections here, even though these have big square sections, the actual edge is curved, so we need to bevel and chamfer everything. But if it's just a blocky square shape, we do not need to edit anything whatsoever. It will print out just fine. So we've established that we need to add supporting geometry to our edges via chamfering or by adding edge loops. Unfortunately, it is very difficult at the moment because our mesh is triangulated. When assets go within a game engine or they get exported, they are often triangulated unless you set it specifically so they can't. So we've established that in order to make our mesh more high poly without altering the silhouette, we do need to add edge loops. But in order to do this, we need to make sure our mesh is quadrified. Our mesh is triangulated. If we try and chamfer or bevel for Maya, along an edge, it will not work properly as it'll be taking the triangulated pieces into account. So we need to quadrify our model. Now, there's a couple of ways we can do this. The first method is the manual method, where we can go ahead and select each edge going across a polygon, which we know is a square, clicking right click and removing. This takes a lot of time, but is very precise, and you get to be the judge of what gets removed, and you can make sure we have good edge flow. The other method is the quadrify all. So I can click here and click on quadrify all. Our entire model has now been quadrified. However, if we have a look here, we can see that we have lost a lot of our edges, and in some cases our mesh is starting to spiral. So if I go ahead and I select the chess piece and isolate it, we can see here we would have had a nice solid edge. Unfortunately, our Quadrify All tool has interpreted this, and we have some spiraling geometry going around, and this will just be unworkable and will take a lot more time to edit and manually fix than it takes to manually remove. But just because it does that on everything doesn't mean that the Quadrify All tool is completely and utterly rubbish. Instead of quadrifying the whole model, we can go ahead and click on Quadrify Selection. Now, Quadrify Selection works best on selected parts. I can select an individual piece, often one that is cylindrical in shape, such as this one. Make sure you go around and actually select the whole section. I can then Geometry, Quadrify Selection, and that has worked like a charm. So it's great on individual selections that are often curved or squared. So anything that's quite blocky will also work quite well because the hard edges are very well defined. And also if we go ahead and we select our helmet here, Geometry, Quadrify Selection, that has worked really well. Now that we've established the two methods, let's go ahead and select our chess piece and show you how to remove and then how to chamfer for good results. Excellent. So I've just detached our chess piece here, and we are going to start along with this arm. Okay, so first task is to remove the geometry. As I said before, we can either do it manually or we can select the section. Because we're having to go around and maybe select all of this anyway, I'm just going to use the edge selection method, where we just go around, select what we want, and then right click remove. Now, I always just do this in sections, and look at this, we've got a nice good edge flow there. The reason I always do this in slow sections is because when you're working on a model such as this, you don't want to get lost or confused with what you're actually editing. So if I'm going to go ahead and work just on this section and add edge flow to here, I don't want to remove all the geometry in one go because I may come back and there may be a mistake. Whereas if I'm working on it now, if there is anything I've missed or I've detached wrong, I can fix it in the moment. So I'll do this section, then move on to the next one. Now that this is all quadrified, I can go and select our edges nice and easily. If I double click, it'll select the entire edge flow of that section. However, if I go ahead over here and I attempt to right click, it will only select that point until the section where it feels the edge flow breaks, because it can't establish, should I go to this line, or this line, there's too many vertices. Otherwise, we need to select everything to then chamfer. So select the edges we want to be hard. As you can see here, we've got a hard cutoff here before it goes in, and this inside section. So now I'm going to go ahead and chamfer. And I'm going to make this as sharp as possible. So I'm going to keep my sharpness all the way up. I want to maintain the hard edge, and I'm going to move my edges not all the way in, but pretty much almost there. So now we have those edges selected. We have our geometry, and our edge is supported, we can turbo smooth. And we can see that's nice and soft. However, when we do turbo smooth, often one iteration will still leave us with a lot of blockiness. So I always recommend at least a 2 or a 3 just to maintain. Here on my mesh, I did 2 iterations of turbo smoothing, which gave me my result, and that's how we have our shoulder such as this. This is 3, so it's not quite as dense, but yeah, 2, that's what I went for. But it also depends on the size of the model you are printing. If I was printing this to be, I don't know, let me think, 30 centimeters tall, 3 turbo smooths, I would still get a bit of blockiness. However, I'm printing this at about 10 centimeters, maybe 7.5. So 2 is perfectly fine. So what we can go ahead, we can collapse this all down, and I can start working on the rest of my model, go around each section. So as you can see, I can do all the way around the base of the dome. I can do the edge coming off of the dome. There's another neckline going down, and then another hood piece here above the block and above the arm. And then as we go towards the belt on the bottom, all of those 90-degree hard angles as well. Now, while that method of going around the edges such as that is great, there may be times when we get an edge that's triangulated on our original model, and if we chamfer it, it does not produce a very good result. So if I go ahead on this model, we have this part of geometry going up here. Now, we've got 2 options. We could remove that, but we're going to lose this piece of silhouette. So I want to maintain this little lip right here. However, if I go ahead and select it, such as this, and then I add a chamfer, actually, I'll select this section as well, just so we can show what it looks like if I'm trying to turbo smooth the whole thing, and then I add my chamfer. Okay, yes, it's adding more geometry. However, if we go ahead and turbo smooth, we have a very sharp pinching, and also our geometry is overlapping a bit and may not produce a smooth result. So, how can we prevent this? Well, what we need to do is add supporting geometry that isn't just a chamfer, and this is a manual job. So, what I needed to do with this model, I needed to do this on the left. So by adding this on the left here, this meant that when I turbo smoothed, I was no longer getting a ridiculous amount of pinching, there was no overlapping, and it could print out very smoothly. As if I look for wireframe there, we can look at that. Nice, gentle gradient into the lip. Okay, so when we do this, we want to try and add edge flow, and we want to make sure our edges are quadded. So I'm just going to quickly show you how I quadded this section. So the way I did this, I believe I also added another line there. So let's add that line. Excellent. So the way I went ahead and added more geometry to this edge was I selected my edges here, and once again we want this all quadded. So I gave this a slight inset. There we go. We've got our inner edge, but we still need our outer edge. So to do this, one of the best ways. Excellent. So to do this, this means our outer edge needs some geometry. So I will need a line going all the way here to help match it. However, if I draw my line all the way to here, we will notice we don't have the geometry to help support it, and we may get some pinching. One of the easiest methods to solve this is you bring this inwards to here and link this downwards. So instead of everything pinching here and becoming really dense, we're bringing our geometry outwards so it can support itself. And this will also be the same on the other side. So let me just continue this edge around. It doesn't really matter if it's too tight for this one, just because I want the geometry there. And once again, I can bring it inwards. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the ways that you can add extra edge geometry in this video, but I will provide a link below on other things you can do. Oop, that's not supposed to be there. Let's target weld that back. Excellent. But yes, just by adding our supporting edges, if we now turbo smooth, there we go. We've got a much better result. Now this top edge isn't actually beveled, so it's giving a bit of an overlap. Here is the chest and headpiece in its final stage, where I've gone around every edge that I've wanted to. I've added the geometry I need to support the edges, and then I can add a turbo smooth. Now, if you've noticed, I haven't actually gone ahead and quadrified the top section. It didn't really matter that much after my turbo smooth result, and also the same, I didn't necessarily need to finish the bottom because it was going to smooth out anyway after the turbo smooth. You can just do that for quality of life, but I only did what was needed. And the same, so normally as well, these blocky bits here, if these weren't attached to this curve section, I wouldn't need to chamfer and do those edges. But because it's attached to this main curved section, those edges also need to be chamfered. And as you see here, if I go around and start turning off turbo smooths, you can see how I've gone around the mesh, just added this geometry, and then added my turbo smooth on top of it. Now, this is the main thing I did, but it isn't the only thing I did. There is another thing I also did to help maintain our silhouette, and it's mainly on anything which is cylindrical or round. And that is adding more edges or more sides to our cylinders so that they don't cave in on themselves. And as an example, let me just quickly go and get a cylinder. To show you what I'm talking about with adding more geometry to the edges, I've got two cylinders. The cylinder on the left has a total of 6 sides, and the cylinder on the right has a total of 18 sides. Fine, right? If we turbo smooth them, that should be great. However, it's not. So our silhouette at the moment, these two have the exact same silhouette. Takes the exact same amount of space, and that means when we have our final asset that's turbo smoothed, we want it to match that amount of space. However, if we have a low amount of sides, that means our mesh can still fall in to itself horizontally here. So if I take this mesh and I turbo smooth, you can see that from the edges, it has caved in a lot. So suddenly, our silhouette has got much more narrow. The way to prevent our mesh becoming more narrow is to add more sides. So if we have a look here, and we go to this mesh, and I add my turbo smooth, as we can see, by turbo smoothing the model, we're losing virtually none of the silhouette. There's maybe a slight bit on the edge, but it's pretty negligible. And then as well, if I go to the top and I bring this one over, this is turbo smoothed, we can see we've lost all of this silhouette on the edge, whereas if we bring the other one over, we have not really lost any at all. So for some sections, we will need to increase the amount of sides we have. And as you can guess, which sides have lots of cylindrical shapes, these are the arms and the legs. If we just take them as default, those will collapse and fall in on themselves, especially because there's not much geometry. And that's why on my final version, as we can see here, if I turn off my turbo smooth and I bring this next to the other arm, we can see that for every section, I've added a line going down. So let's quickly start doing that. So let's take our mesh, Quadrify Selection, and then connect. Now, connecting and adding a line in the middle is not enough, because at the moment, yes, it's adding more geometry, but we also need to go ahead and pull that geometry out. Now, this point is quite front-facing, so if we wanted, we could just pull it a little bit like this. Now, while this may work for this section, it may not work if we're talking about using the entire arm piece here. Now, instead of just selecting all of our geometry manually and pulling it out, which does take a little bit of time and also mean our flow isn't going and matching exactly to what our edges are doing, what we can do instead is to click on an entire looped section and then click on Set Flow. Now, we've clicked Set Flow, so it's averaged out each point between the existing geometry and it's averaged it. The only thing to be cautious about with Set Flow is that when it goes to edges, it can go over a little bit. So at the moment, we can see our middle point between these should be these, so we may need to pull it up manually. So just check those edges. However, if we had this going down also to here, this would also average out and we wouldn't get that problem. Before we're done, there is another thing we need to talk about, and that is thickening things up. Some pieces of geometry on our model may be too thin for 3D printing. For example, here. We can see these are going to a point and they're becoming almost plane-like and they won't be printed out well. So you will have to go ahead and remake that geometry but thicker, because if I print this out on a miniature scale, this will be so thin that it won't even support itself. Even when I printed out this, it ended up being too thin and snapped off too easily. So while we do want to maintain our original model so it looks as accurate as it does before the game, we will need to go ahead and thicken it up. So you may need to exaggerate and make it much bigger than normal. So here we are, and we are almost done. There is one more thing we need to talk about, and that is filling in holes and capping. So if I go ahead here, and I select this section, and I duplicate this out. Let's clone to object so it's separated. If we have a look here, we can see there's no cap on this object. But that is okay. Not every object needs to be attached together. So if we go around our silhouette, we can't see any geometry over here, or over here. As long as it intersects, it will print out the geometry together when slicing. But it is okay to have some uncapped sections. However, that is under the caveat that the capped section is fully going into the geometry of the whole object. So if our mesh was like this with this uncapped section, it would not print properly. However, if it was all in like this, it would print correctly. Now, how will it print or how will it splice if it is not on that capped section? So even if it's not on that capped section a little bit, it will act as if the entire edge is not capped. And when it slices, it goes up the z-axis. And therefore, anything on the z-axis will not print. So we've got our asset, and let's quickly select a slice plane. So if I select slice plane, we can see our plane is currently on the z-axis. If we go to where our mesh starts, here, or the highest point of our capped section, our splicer will not splice anything from the bottom of it to the top of it. So if I slice, go ahead and do this, I can delete that, okay? The reason all of this deletes is because as it goes from the capped section along horizontally, it cannot cap. It cannot find an edge, it cannot complete that loop. However, the moment we go above this, we can go from this side here all the way to this side here, and it is completely enclosed. However, if we once again go back, if we go from this here, all the way to this side. Yes, this part is closed, but this side is not closed. So everything along this axis will just get deleted, and it will only want to print like this. That's the reason why on my high poly asset, or on my asset, I didn't actually realize till this at the end, because I separated out the pieces quite a lot, and I also deleted the body. Unfortunately, I left this end uncapped, so it didn't want to print anything from the arm below here and anything up to here. So what I had to do was cap it, but then also make sure it intersected the model enough. So I just capped, dragged it out, and that was enough for it to print correctly because it was fully intersecting. And that is everything done. We have taken our original mesh, we have checked that it doesn't have any errors, we have increased the amount of geometry, we've gone ahead and added supporting edges, we've quadrified what was needed to quadrify as we went, we maintained our silhouette by adding more edges on cylindrical sides such as the legs and the arms. We've talked about which parts we don't need to touch. Anything that does not have a curved section, we do not need to chamfer the edges because it will print hard. And we've talked about capping, filling in holes, and intersecting into our model. We can finally go ahead, File, Export, Export as STL, save it whatever we want, click Save, and select it only. Open up your splicer of choice. Mine is Cura. Open your file. I named mine Engineer V3. Excellent, and that's loaded in there. Now, it does say it has errors, but that's just because some parts are uncapped, but that is completely fine. And I'm just going to put that to 33% scale. And I'm also going to import our original. And put that to 33% scale. And let's drag him over. And as we can see, if we go ahead and look closely at our model, don't worry, all of these edges are just because they're uncapped, but as long as they're intersecting, that is okay. But as we can see, our final result is much smoother and much more high fidelity than our blocky boy over here. Select all the settings you want, click on Slice, and now let's preview. Excellent, so I've got the support geometry on there, but we can ignore that mostly. So anyway, if we go ahead and I start pulling my model down, once again, we can see our arms, nice, smooth and round, our chest piece, nice, smooth and round. However, if we go over here, big, blocky, low fidelity, looks polygony, which is very unfortunate. But anyway, yeah, that's how we go ahead and print our asset. Or take an asset from a game and convert it into a file so it can be 3D printed without being blocky. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, like, comment, or subscribe. If you've got any questions, comment. If you disliked, dislike. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.